Hello and welcome back to Meet the Poet. For this session, we're joined by Chrissy Banks and Alasdair Paterson, two incredibly experienced and accomplished poets. Chrissy is a former teacher, counsellor and trainer who's had 4 poetry books published, and her work featured in many prestigious journals, including the Rialto, the North, Agenda and many more. Alasdair used to be an academic librarian, which took him travelling across a lot of the former Soviet Union for various academic projects. He won an Eric Gregory Award for his poetry in 1975 and has published numerous poetry collections. Together, Chrissy and Alasdair organise and present the Uncut Poets Reading Series, which is Exeter's monthly poetry platform, and they're joining us to share some of their own work and to chat about their experiences in writing and publishing poetry. So a huge welcome to Chrissy and Alasdair. How are you both doing?
Oh, pretty well, really, all things considered, at our advanced age, we're still creaking along. No, I'm delighted to be here. How about you, Chrissy?
Well, yes, I'm pretty good too. And I'd just like to point out that you are more advanced than me in age.
Well, it's fantastic to have you both here. And I think we should probably start off by maybe just hearing from each of you how and when you first started writing poetry. So maybe let's begin with Chrissy on answering this question.
Well, I think I was probably about 5 when I wrote my very first poem, but then I didn't really start writing seriously until I was in my early 30s, I think, because I'd studied literature and was aware of so many really great poets, and I knew that I was never going to be able to compare with them, but so it put me off for a while. And of course, like anything else that is worth learning, you just have to start wherever you start and take things step by step and day by day. So many years later, here I am, still reaching for a place far off, but just enjoying every poem I write.
Absolutely. And how about you, Alasdair?
Well, I suppose I was another late comer to the writing of poetry. I'd always read poetry and been surrounded by it, and did an English degree, although it was mainly medieval poetry of limited use these days. But when I moved to Liverpool when I was 25, and everybody was a poet in Liverpool back then, so I thought I'd have a go at this and see how I got on. And I just enjoyed the evenings, which were they were kind of performance evenings, weren't they? It was more a spoken poetry than a written poetry in Liverpool back then. And from then I just continued with it, and I had a 20-year break in the middle there, but I came back in the early years of this century, and I'm writing again, so really enjoying it.
Fantastic. Well, I've got lots of questions to come for you in a little bit, Alasdair, but first up we're going to hear from Chrissy. And Chrissy, your first reading is from your collection, The Uninvited, which came out in 2019 from Indigo Dreams. And before we hear from that collection, just a couple of questions. So I wondered, actually, do you have a particular process when writing your poetry? Do you set aside time to do it, or do you just go when the inspiration strikes and you have to write then?
Well, that's a good question. I think my process has changed over the years, and now I have more time than ever to write, and yet I probably write less. I think there's something to be said for having a fairly concentrated period of time in which you Yes, you have to get down and do it then. It's like, if you don't, then it's not going to happen. So I'm very good now at distracting myself, putting it off. That big fear of failure. It's always there in the background. So do I have a regular process? Every now and then I say, I'm going to do this, I'm going to set aside this time every day, and then I don't do it. So the answer to your question in short is no.
Yeah. That often seems like quite a common answer. I don't think you're alone on that one. So, okay, could you tell our audience a bit about the collection, The Uninvited, before we hear from it? And, what spurred you on to write it?
Yeah, so the poems in The Uninvited were written over quite a long period of time. I had a collection called Days of Fire and Flood that came out in 2000 and something, about 6, I think. And the years following on from that were probably when I was working pretty much full time one way or another, and I had young children. So I didn't get very much time to write then, but over the years I gathered poems, and then probably from about 2015 onwards, I had a bit more time and I wrote more, and it was more concentrated work. So I had a fair collection I wanted to do something with, and I entered Indigo Dreams competition for a full collection, and I was shortlisted. I didn't win, but I was shortlisted. So I approached them and said, could I send you a manuscript, or would you consider the manuscript I sent you? And fortunately, they liked it and said yes. So that's how it happened, really. So the first poem is called The Horrible Haircuts of Childhood. And I guess many of us suffer indignities and humiliations as children. And for me, one of them was being taken to have my hair cut, which was never as I wanted it. The horrible haircuts of childhood. I remember the horrible haircuts, trapped in the chair, tied up in a nylon gown, condemned to watching it happen, mute, full face in the mirror, like viewing your own execution while the serial hair killer witters about holidays, shopping, school, the weather, pretending there's no ritual sacrifice going on as she shreds you with eager scissors. My hair was never that long in the first place, and the short, blunt cut was always wrong. The way a pair of curtains hung but chopped in half are wrong. My face, stripped naked, too plainly showed I longed to die quickly. All hiding places gone. You'll be glad to know that I quite enjoy going to the hairdressers these days, but I've decided to grow my hair long, so it doesn't happen often. The next poem I actually wrote a few years ago. It was in the midst of austerity cuts. It was just post Brexit. It was when Trump was elected. It was during a lot of protest about climate change. But of course, the pandemic came along, and so that rather increased the state of emergency in my mind. So this is how do you know it's an emergency? Fever, cold, nausea, a rash, shortness of breath. How do you know it's an emergency? The doctors are on sick leave. Your ops rescheduled once again. How do you know it's an emergency? The sleeping bags in doorways, the queues for food, lately not even a dog. How do you know it's an emergency? They cut the fat, they cut the flesh, and now they cut the vein. How do you know it's an emergency? A stampede, a man with 2 guns and a butcher's knife. How do you know it's an emergency? The sea is in the streets, the chairs and tables are swimming. How do you know it's an emergency? The charred skeletons of buildings, the charred skeletons. How do you know it's an emergency? As water rises, crew and captain avoid counting the lifeboats. How do you know it's an emergency? As we sail towards the waterfall, crew and captain look the other way. How do you know it's an emergency? They could still turn around. They will not turn around. How do you know it's an emergency? Fever, cold, nausea, a rash, shortness of breath. There's also a reference there to the Grenfell fire and to the killing of Joe Cox. Quite some time. This too, all these poems in this first half are from the Uninvited. This poem is called The Sex Life of Paperclips, which I thought actually would probably make a great title for a collection, but I didn't want you to think all the poems in it were about sex lives or indeed about paperclips. So this started with an observation about the way paperclips get themselves all tangled up together, even though they're presumably just lying in a drawer. And it took me to an unexpected place. The sex life of paperclips. He drew my attention to paperclips, their furtive encounters, their magic tricks. How does inanimate stuff like this secretly manage to shift and hitch? Necklaces left in a fastened box end up coiled in unravelable knots in a ménage à trois with a silver cross and dangly earrings or bracelet watch. I'm starting to notice it everywhere. The toothy kiss of some forks ensnared, post-tumble tights and a sweater, the pair in a Velcro clinch on a bedroom chair. But if it's a crackle of static that smacks us together, what holds over time is the mass of poppers and studs, the clasp and the catch. A hook pulls away and an eye pulls back. And lastly, this is the title poem from The Uninvited. The Uninvited, I wrote this poem after a trip to Thailand, where we had an unexpected and uninvited guest in the like the lodge we were staying in, which was in the midst of a great kind of jungle of exotic plants. And it's sort of informed by Buddhist philosophy. The Uninvited. We flew to a country of golden temples, golden Buddhas 6 times as tall as a man. But now, here's what I think about most. Garden lodge, petals-strewn bed, bowl of fruit on a table, banana skin partially stripped, flesh well chomped, not by us, too munched for a mouse. I ransacked cupboards, peered under chairs, searched for a hole, a gap, a crack big enough. Had I left a window open, a door unlatched? Someone delivered a metal cage, banana baited. At first, not a squeak. Then I woke to a maniac rattling of bars. The thing and I stared at each other. Fingery claws, breathing fur, the naked flecks of its tail. Those eyes, onyx black. I could just about watch as it shivered there in the cage. But when it was gone, it was still here, in a sealed wooden house. Me and the creature, all one, according to Buddha. What lives in shadow is always seeking a gap.
Definitely deserves a round of applause. That was a wonderful first reading. And that last line, what lives in shadow is always seeking a gap, that really stays with you. This might sound like a very big question, but I've been doing a bit of research. I've been doing my research and found out that obviously at one point in your life, you used to be a psychodynamic counsellor. That's right, isn't it? And I wondered if that job, or really any of your other jobs, but mainly this one, if that influenced how you write, especially thinking on this last poem. It could be open to interpretation, but it's very reflective, and there's this search for identity almost, and understanding something within oneself. And I sort of found out that psychodynamic counselling fits into that idea of that deep exploration of yourself and bringing the unconscious mind into the conscious. I wondered if that rings any bells for you at all.
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. So, the idea of the shadow, like the hidden part of the self, or the unknown, even definitely the unconscious part of the self. That's a Jungian concept, and most of my training was Freudian rather than Jungian, but we did do a bit of Jungian theory as well, and some of the ideas and concepts that I came across during my training, I just found absolutely fascinating. And I think probably every psychotherapist goes into the training and into the work wanting to learn more about how our minds work, and wanting to understand themselves and those they're close to as fully as possible. So yes, so for me, that kind of those ways of thinking are really helpful when I encounter something like the rat in that poem, because I have a total phobia about rats. So rather than it just spoiling the holiday, it was useful to think about how can I see this experience? How can it take me forward? And of course, there was a big thing there about facing my fears. Which is easier when the source of your fear is in a cage and was looking absolutely terrified itself.
Oh, yeah. It's fascinating to hear your influences. And we'll be coming back to you in a little bit, Chrissy, but next we will be hearing from Alasdair for Alice's first reading. Now, Alasdair, you're a very accomplished writer, and as I said earlier, you've won an Eric Gregory Award, but then you took a 20-year break from publishing poetry, and I wondered why you decided to do that.
Yes, well, at a certain point in my life, it was time to go a bit serious with the career or not, so I decided to do that, and I got into positions where I couldn't be half-hearted about what I was doing. I directed the library of University College Cork in Ireland, and then came back and worked in Sheffield and then Exeter University Libraries as a director. And there wasn't a lot of spare time or capacity once you've factored your family in. So I decided, I guess, not to choose Bohemia for my kids, but it was always my plan that in my late 50s I would retire and come back to writing again, and that possible consoling fiction kept me going, but it turned out to be true, which is exactly what I did, and so that explains it. I think I have something in me that can't be half-hearted about things. If I'm going to do something, I have to do it thoroughly. So that was the career for 20-odd years, 21, 22. And then retired, and 2007 I started writing again and churned out a few more books.
So were you still writing the whole time, or was it just that you weren't focusing on publishing them? Did you?
No, I think the only things that I wrote in that time was I had a brief spell of writing haiku, which is more a kind of mental exercise than anything really sort of prolonged. I did enjoy it, and I think it stood me in good stead, actually. But apart from that, I was writing reports and budgets and strategic plans and other works of possible fiction, but that got very prompt attention and answers, which you don't always get with poetry, of course.
Yeah. Okay, I think it's time that we heard some of your poems, so I'll hand over to you for your first reading.
Okay, well, I'm going to start off with one of the first poems I ever wrote, which was in a little collection called Poems for Duane Russo. Russo was a French primitive, naive outsider artist, early 20th century, who painted very exotic jungle scenes. But this is one about fishermen, and it sort of encapsulates what I get still as the feeling of being just about to get a poem right. So this is Fishermen. The fishermen are patient. Their lines settle in clear water. Their wide-brimmed hats will keep off everything. On the boulevards, meantime, carriages come and go. They carry doctors to quiet basements and children to circuses, music masters to doleful violins, and lovers to strange ceremonies of whalebone and gardenias. The fishermen are unimpressed. Over clear water, where the rod's end dances, the world is almost under control, and everything that matters is just about to happen. It's in Life-Saving Poems, among other places. So 2010, going forward, fast forward, I brought out a volume called On the Governing of Empires, which was looking at various empires, mainly Byzantine, but not only. And this poem is a challenge that I took up to try and write something interesting about the Chinese Imperial Civil Service, which I noticed was a place where the humdrum nature of life was given colour by giving everything and everyone a unique name. So this is called On the Nomenclature. Father knew his place. It was near the north gate of the auxiliary winter capital, in the quarter of the middling sort. I climbed it for both of us, the mountain of graduated merit, to the thud of plummeting bodies. I examined away my youth in the hall of indelible nightmares, to the accompaniment of terminal sobbing. Then it was, farewell, happy father. My first posting was an assistantship in the region of windswept borders, where I gave good calligraphy in the third war of pointless encroachment. Later in the capital, I enjoyed prestigious posts, keeper of the library of unlearned lessons, and later the first curator of the burnt library museum. Yes, interesting times. When I was installed on the Committee of Unthinkable Thoughts, under the Prince with the Bees in his bonnet, a new title seemed to beckon me, till all that free-form thinking triggered the Great Autumn Purge, resulting in 5 uncomfortable days in the Chamber of Extruded Truth before a ceremony-free award of the Brown Fan of Early Retirement, second class. Where I live now, the locals will direct you to the famous mountain hut of the retired administrator. But I'm always careful to point out it's really just my dwelling, that I haven't got round to calling anything fancy, and my garden is not defined by willows or chrysanthemums or that big mountain it clings to. What I've learned, I think, is how everything under language slips and slides and bites, and how in the end language makes its excuses and heads for the beach, where every wave is new and gone. And I sit late. Night rises from the valley, and one by one the lights come on like memories and stay wavering like memories, and later, one by one, go out like names. This next one is from a pamphlet called Brumaire, and later, Brumaire being the French Revolutionary Month, the Misty Month. But the second half of that was a set of poems about revolutionary Russia and its aftermath. And this one is called Bookmark, and it's based on something that happened to Solzhenitsyn in Soviet times when he was imprisoned in Moscow before he was sent to the Gulag. They found there was a librarian in this prison, and she came round with a trolley, and on the trolley were all the books of people who had been imprisoned or executed, and their books had been seized and were prescribed out there in the world. So this is called Bookmark. These books that can never go back through the gates, out under the streetlights, leave their isotope dust in late trams and cafes and turned over apartments. These books inside here for the duration, jammed on trolleys, still dangerous in their scuffed half-lives. These books are brought to you before lights out, to cells where their authors were last seen or heard of. You know what it means, this contempt, like tenderness. You recognize by now the gentle sine wave of revenge. It means you're free to read yourself out of the world, sit by the dead, eat the salt, as if every turned page you scan before the bullet by just that much could diminish them and you. Instead, in these open books, streetlights and cityscapes glow, not as you loved them, but as you longed to love them. Voices not to be silenced are no longer whispering. Instead, when you open these books, the last of you flows into them like a charge. And finally, for this half, I mentioned that I lived in Liverpool, and I was there for about 14 years. Did lots of poetry readings, played in a band, all those things, and got married as well, and started a family. And this is the Pier Head. The Pier Head is that bit on the riverfront where boats sailed from, and immigrant ships set off from, and slave ships docked as well. So it's like the history of Liverpool just in one place. So Pier Head. This was always a good place to get your heart broken and find a song to patch it. I don't say mend. Last ferry, last train, or under the salty tons of Mersey, in radio silence, neon on the windscreen, just sing, will you? And find someone to tell you worse things happened at sea. They did too, out there, beyond the emigration piers, beyond the slavery piazzas, the lightening cargoes pitching westward, the music's nursed, barely alive, for a new soil, where they scattered and flowered and seeded and mingled, and came back here on vinyl under seamen's arms. So off we went again, Stratocaster and Hofner, jangling and thumping, new songs for old, for new heartbreaks. Just sing, will you? Just sing.
Brilliant. Definitely deserving another round of applause. Thank you, Alasdair. What was really nice was hearing poetry from a range of your collections and pamphlets. I mean, I've lost track of how many you've released, but do you write quickly? How are you able to have released so many?
What I tend to do, I think I've noticed two things about why I write and how I write. One is that quite often I write because I notice something out of the corner of my eye, which then gets my attention. So I have to write to understand why I'm grabbed by this thing. And the second thing is that I tend to write around a subject. So I tend to have clusters of poems, like facets of that subject. So one kind of generates the other. So I guess even allowing for the 20 minutes, the 20 years of downtime, I've still put quite a lot of years into the poetry business. And so I've had time to write all these things. And since I retired, of course, I have output a reasonable amount. Although, like Chrissy, there are so many competing things when you're retired. It's not like work leaves this huge gap in your life. There are just other things that you've always wanted to do, and developing families and so on that fill those gaps. So, yes, that's the reason, I guess.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Alasdair. We will now head back to Chrissy for your second reading, and this is from your most recent collection, Frank, which came out earlier this year with the Poetry Business's Smith Doorstop imprint. Could you just tell us a little bit about the collection before we hear from it?
Yes, this is Frank, and can you see? And I'm just wondering how to sum it up, really, because I do tend to. Some people have a very favourite theme or a very favourite focus. And like Alasdair was saying, we'll cluster poems around that theme or that focus. But similarly to Alasdair, I tend to write about what kind of catches my attention, and I follow it, whatever it is. And so it can mean that the poems are on a really wide-ranging variety of subjects. But I do mainly write about people. And so a lot of the poems in this book are either about individuals or they're about relationships, and kind of looking at the dynamics of the relationships or the psychology of the relationship. And there's just a few which are about the natural world. So, because it's a pamphlet, there are only, I think, about 20 poems, so it's a slimmer volume than the Uninvited. But I try to kind of have a range of moods as well. So some of them are sort of light and amusing, and others a bit deeper and darker, or a lot deeper and darker.
Well, let's hear from it. Over to you, Chrissy.
So the first poem I'm going to read is called At the Juliet House, Verona. And it seems that we're, or many of us, are such romantics that we're willing to swallow what frankly are illusions or fake stories. And so people, when they go to Verona, flock to what is called the Juliet House, Juliet referring to Shakespeare's character from Romeo and Juliet. And it has a balcony, and it's an old-looking house, but there's absolutely nothing to say that an actual Juliet lived there. And not only do people go there and believe that this is the house where Juliet lived, but also they write letters as if they're writing to an agony aunt and send them to the Juliet house. So over time, a team of agony aunts has gathered to write replies to these letters. At the Juliet house, Verona. You can buy a heart, plastic, sealed with a seam. It'll sit in your palm unbeating. You can rub the bronze of Juliet's right breast, wish for a new love to come to you within a year. You can stand on the balcony in blue shorts or a wedding dress and call your Romeo's name. But the balcony was carved from an old sarcophagus for a Hollywood film of the play, and history shows no Juliet, although if you write to her at this address, Juliet will answer. And this next poem, Cicada Love Song, is for anyone who is longing right now to be somewhere hot and exotic. I know I am. Cicada Love Song. Like lads who congregate in squares of French or Spanish villages, like men grouped at a table outside an Italian bar, you and the cicada boys hang out to flex your timbals and flick your wings, build your trance and techno buzz to rev up any female for a mile around. Hot pink hibiscus, bougainvillea, and yours the persistent soundtrack to all our lazy holidays. The hotter the sun, the louder the stridulation, your vibrations, the escalating thrum of how it was to be young, thirst never quenched, heat like a hungry kiss on the skin. And I should have just explained those technical words. Timbals are the part of the cicada that makes that vibrating sound, and The stridulation is the technical term for it. And also just to point you in the direction of Exeter University's project on insects, which was run by Fiona Benson, the poet Fiona Benson. Some of her own poems are there, and many poems about many different species of insect on that site. Another creature now, this time the magnificent whale. I think, especially during lockdown, the natural world has really been helpful in helping people to feel uplifted. I think the natural world can be observing, and being in nature can be so healing. And this was a poem written after a whale watching trip off the coast of Argentina. Young again. As if they'd been waiting for us, they appear, their black backs, two wet rocks that have learned to swim. Show-offs, mother and baby, snorting fountains that glide, buck and dip, play us with their vanishing acts. And there reappear upended, cleft tails raised till, toppling, a weight of leather slaps against the ocean's skin. Then the mother whale glides under the world of the boat, and we are young again, bums up, leaning over the side to witness the slow slide of her back emerging, and it keeps coming moment by moment, mile by mile, like a planet swimming itself through the birthing waters, back when time itself was a child. So this poem is about Ola, who in the book there are poems about people, some of them real, some of them fictional, some of them real with fictional details. This is Ola, who is very real. The music is way up loud, and so is she, just back from Ibiza where she danced all week. Today in the gym, it's body jam, Ola out front. She swishes her palomino ponytail. I've missed you so much, she swears to us all in warm Ukrainian vowels. Her skin shines like butterscotch. Her electrics are all turned on, smiles sparking, whites of her green eyes lit up. That power is pumping out, and Ola is spreading her arms as though she'd embrace us all. I feel so good, she proclaims, skipping from side to side, head thrown back to the ceiling. Her hands smooth her body from neck to thighs as she sways. You don't have to do this, she smiles. But the slender girls, the new mothers, the serious muscled of either sex, the young pensioners in the back row, one way or another, we all want what you have, Ola. Turn, she says, and we turn. Spin, she commands, and we spin. Fly, we're flying, we fly. Ola, even your name is a whoop of joy. And my last poem is the title poem from Frank. Frank, somebody once met, never forgotten, and an early learning experience for me. Frank, in that very southern university, we were northern aliens, experiments in academia, mad in love with literature, first in the family to win a place. Winter or summer, he shrugged thin arms into a khaki parka, his hook nose poked from a face pale as bleached flour. He kissed me once in Anglo-Saxon, rough and slobbery. Frank couldn't do with borrowed thought. When he spat words straight from the seam, his tutor's eyes lit up. He didn't give a toss if they agreed or not. Analysing Hamlet, he's fucking fucked. Evaluating Wordsworth, that bloke wins first prize for turning kids off poetry. Rattling off his own deranged and genius critique of Hemingway, he gobbed and scrawled himself a first. The last I heard, he'd won a scholarship, soared off to be Frank in New York, while I wondered what it meant to graduate. What I'm thinking now, too late, is this. I could have learnt a lot from Frank.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you, Chrissy. I too wish that I could have met Frank. I think, we could all probably learn a lot from that sort of character. But that was a fantastic reading. Thank you. And I think we will head straight over to Alasdair's second reading now, which is a lot of it's from your most recent collection. So there's Silent Years, My Life, and 10 Poems About Getting Older. And I wondered, just before we hear the poems, if you thought that has your poetry changed over the years, and from where you began to where you are now with the focus of these three collections?
Yes, that's a good question. I keep asking myself whether it's changed much. I think it's become probably a bit more narrowed and idiosyncratic, and maybe self-indulgent than it once was. But I find that I get less and less bothered about expectations of what a poem should be, and I get a lot of fun from pushing sometimes to see how far I can take an idea, or what form I can find to best express it in. And I guess you can do that when you're reasonably confident. At first when you're writing, it's not that it's being done well, it's just the wonder that it's being done at all. Like a dog walking on its hind legs, I guess. But eventually you get this, you get into your own groove, don't you? And that takes you in lots of unexpected directions. And part of you thinks, to hell with anybody else, really. Which is probably fatal, but never mind.
To take.
Sorry?
No, I think that's a good attitude. I think that's a good attitude to take.
Thank you. Well, Silent Years, which is this volume here, and from Flare Stack, is the one I never wanted to write, because half of it, the bigger part of it, is a number of poems written about that first year after my wife died, and that was nearly 6 years ago now. And Silent Years, because the thing you notice is the silence, and indeed it's even worse than silence. It's a kind of absence. It's the absence of a voice that you feel very keenly. And so I was writing again about aspects of that experience of grieving, really. So this first one is called Pin Drop. Mine was ever the contemplative way. Think pin drop cloisters. Think tonsure advent. You were for the mystery tour, with picnic and live commentary, for full colour mix of words that launched and whirligigged, the way our yew tree fired off goldfinches. Now I'm left here to think about it. And I will. And I will. The moment silence stops breaking in on everything. And this second one is called Regrets, which is regrets being a part of grief. What could I have done better? Why did I say what I said these years ago? Could I have been better? All those. But the first few lines reference that famous song by Frank Sinatra, My Way. And I do that because, in fact, my wife was very distantly related to Frank Sinatra. Her mother's cousin married a cousin of Frank Sinatra's in New Jersey back in the day sometime. So we always called him Uncle Frank. I could call to mind more than a good few. But then again, that would just encourage them. They'd be round. They'd be on the doormat. The usual harbingers, brushing themselves off, a bit of throat clearing. Is it a song you're wanting? Arpeggios chimed on an ice instrument is their trademark a cappella. Their soft shoe patters like tears in permafrost. And that dreary repertoire with the same backing track, snow driven through birches on roads you never thought you'd be driving by yourself. They'd be round, like the shot that starts the avalanche. Mid-song you'd feel the tremor, the mass of it, not far away at all, and closing, fast. This is from My Life, a curious title, but all the pieces in it are my life with, my life as, my life in, mainly imaginary biographical bits, but not all of them. And this first one is kind of autobiographical, and it's about my school back in Edinburgh. I came from a less favoured part of Edinburgh, Leith, which is the port, and thanks to the support of my parents, I eventually got to a fee-paying school up in Edinburgh itself, and had a classical education. And looking back, I can see that I was all the efforts of the school were to kind of make me lose myself and become some kind of standard product of that kind of education, which I never became. So this one is called My Life as a Pict. Pict is beyond you. Pict is out of bounds. Pict is back there in the fern shadow daub, in the blue dapple pine, waiting for a legion. Schooling, schooled. The portico was Athens of the North, but the shadows were Roman, with certain local features, such as school houses, soundly in the classical tradition, but named for barbarous nations, Angles, Britons, Picts, Scots, King Kenneth MacAlpin's fusion quartet. I was a Pict. I was there to be absorbed. I was there to disappear. I was there to lose my language. Not Leith, but Lethe. Pict is the weave of absence, the riddle guessed by ramparts, the language of bitten tongue. Pict is water on the carved rock, when snakes ripple and boars rush, and a few words flicker, words or parts of words like sword sparks or plough spray or smuts from a hearth or names for the vanished headland, till the stone dries and calms. Not only, but also, either or, unless, then. There was balance in the Dominie's tough prescriptions, a blueprint for a world of certain consequences, of triumphal chariots you could ride on or trail behind in chains. Unless. In his hands he hefted more than a shape. There was Caesar's skull, chalk dust made palpable. And from the depths of his robe, the leather, the sanction, the shining, forked, thunderous end of the matter, then. But picked as across the senseless river, and far from the snatch, snarl, bite, loose from porticos, from cloisters, picked as words snagged in the memory, picked as the secret paths, the night walking, picked as inside, picked as inside, picked as inside. Bit of childhood trauma with the belt there as well, which was a great weapon of classics teachers, particularly. In here, there's also My Life as a Mad King, and these are poems ostensibly written by a mad king. They're villanelles, 19-line poems, and first and third line repeat with variations throughout. The king, I imagine, is well up to counting to 19 and getting the repetitions and so on. He's no good at rhyme, because I think that's part of the problem of his life, that nothing actually rhymes. But this is a kind of megalomaniac one, this one, Villanelle the 15th. The planet spins me through the dark. My cosmos is blacker than yours. I never ask for signs of grace. I fought the wars of missing gods. My God is more absent than yours. The planet turns me to the dark. In the banned book library, my worms are better read than yours. I never looked for signs of grace. New worlds wear my livery. My germs are better armed than yours. The planet sneezes through the dark. My sins fill up a box a day. My soul flight floats lighter than yours. I never lack for signs of grace. My winding sheet stays under wraps. My shelf life is longer than yours. The planet spins me through the dark. I never ask for signs of grace. That was before Donald Trump that I wrote that one. Strangely prophetic, as it turned out. And finally, this one is from 10 Poems About Getting Older, one of these Candlestick Press collections you can give instead of a card. So if you've got an old friend, you can give them a little book of poems about getting older and write something on the title page. Probably something rude, but anyway. But this one is called Hop. Nipping up the 2 Axminstered steps from the hotel breakfast room, my legs performed a kind of hop that strangers to inside my body might have classed graceful, insouciant. A sprezzatura of top hat and tails. Right away the word hoard creaked open to offer spry, adjective, active, lively, nimble, brisk, especially of the elderly. And Luke, to help me, it came out already connected to sprightly and spruce, like jigsaw pieces the previous solver hadn't bothered to take apart. Spry, origin unclear, maybe 18th century. Examples of modern usage: furrows and cheek bulges, stubble-free. Zips and buttons engaged and double-checked. Savage eyebrows whipped back to the cage. Legs gamely populating cordons of trouser. And here I was now, inescapably me onwards for the duration of spry. Like a dancer running out of melody, a boulevardier running out of boulevard, a prize winner running out of shelf. though who could forget? I will, one day. The model patient, open heart section, rosette, the as good as it gets residual lifetime award. And so, for good measure, I hopped back down the steps and then hopped back up again. No one was watching.
Thank you, Alasdair. And thank you to both of you. You've both been brilliant guests. We've come to the end of this session. But thank you for joining us on Meet the Poet. It's been really nice to chat to you and hear a selection of your work. Thank you also to everyone who's been watching at home. You can sign up to the Homestage Poetry mailing list as linked below if you'd like to be notified about all future poetry events like this one. Some of our upcoming guests, if you're interested, on Meet the Poet include Pratibha Castle, Zoe Siobhan Howarth Lowe, Caleb Places, and Sam Buchan Watts. So if you have any questions you'd like to ask them, just send them over to us as soon as possible. And don't forget that a week today, we're welcoming Caroline Bird to Homestage to discuss her Forward Prize-winning collection, The Air Year. You won't want to miss it. But that's all for now. A huge thank you again to Chrissy Banks and Alasdair Paterson, and I'll see you all next time.
Thank you.